Hello. Welcome to the Adam Smith Institute webinar. I'm Dr. Madsen Pirie, the president of the Adam Smith Institute, and tonight's webinar is about open societies. And our guest on this webinar is Johan Norberg. Now, Johan is a best-selling author, but he's also a lecturer, a filmmaker, and an historian of ideas. He's the author of In Defense of Global Capitalism, and also Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future. Indeed, I think Johan is the only person I know who's as optimistic as I am, and that's saying something. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, executive editor at Free to Choose Media, where he makes documentaries for US public television. His latest book is called Open, The Story of Human Progress. And that is what I want to talk about tonight. So, Johan, first off, you're talking about open societies. Would you start by telling us what constitutes an open society? What are its essential characteristics?
Yes, that's a great starting point. And thanks for inviting me, Madsen. Looking forward to this discussion. When I talk about open societies, I could go into details about various forms of openness. But if I had to define it briefly, I'd say the open society is the society that is a work in progress. That's not fixed or designed by any kind of blueprint, any plan, any kind of command and control structure. It's open to surprises in technology, in business models, in cultural expressions. And that's important because all the great things that we have, all the innovations from the umbrella and the vaccine to the Enlightenment and free speech were originally seen as worthless, impossible, or dangerous by most people. So it's important with an open society that lets the minority, the individual, tinker and experiment with it. If I had to mention one policy aspect of it, it would be rule of law rather than rule by whim, because it's easier to be surprising and unpredictable if the rules are predictable.
Yes, I see. In the book, you deal a lot in the first bit with trade. Quite surprising. I found it very refreshing and very informative. How extensive was trade in early prehistoric communities? How important was it in setting humankind on that upward path to progress?
Yes, this is something that has surprised me as well. The better archaeologists become and the better method they have, the more examples they find of trade, even long distance trade among early humans. And the further back they push, the further back in time they push the first instances of long distance trade. And now we've actually learned that trade is at least as old as humans. We have the first human fossils of Homo sapiens. It's 300,000 years ago. And it's amazing to find that so are the first instances of long distance trade. In what is now Kenya, archaeologists have found a treasure trove of very specialized tools that are 300,000 years old, and they are made of obsidian. And that's important because obsidian is a volcanic glass. So it's only produced in a few volcanic places. And what the researchers think is that this group, they got this material from somewhere else, 55 miles away. So they think that this indicates the first instances that we know about of long distance trade. So it's basically Adam Smith's truck, barter and exchange 300,000 years ago. But well, of course, that's just part of it. We also have trade within the tribes constantly, trading favors, know-how, ideas, and goods.
You point out that as well as trade in goods and services, there was also a trade in ideas. Are there any particular features that have made some societies more receptive than others to ideas coming in from outside? Is there something about it? Yeah. I was saying, is there something about a society that makes it more receptive?
Yes, there is. And there's one geographical feature, being at the crossroads between different cultures that have reached some important extent of production or of creativity is important, because then you open yourselves up to that. But it also then helps, wherever you are, to be a trading nation, a nation of seafarers, because then you start to compare and find discoveries and knowledge and ideas that you didn't have before, and that breaks down the taboos, the hierarchies you had. And obviously that's an important condition in itself, to have a certain decentralization within the society, so that there's no crushing official orthodoxy deciding what's right and what's wrong, so that there's some room for being the odd man out.
Yeah, okay. You in the first half of the book, you have a quartet of openness, open exchange, open doors, open minds, and of course, open societies. And yet you point out that Song China had all of those 1,000 years ago. And we're even beginning to use machines for manufacturing. Yet they didn't progress to an industrial revolution like the UK did. And the obvious question is, why didn't they? What was it that stopped it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because this is a sad story of what could have been. It was not just what was happening in terms of manufacturing and technological innovation, but also you could see the beginning of cultural changes, like towards more of individualism and self-exploration in Song China. But that was not to be. And the simple answer is war and disasters. But I also think that that's the wrong answer, because ideas don't disappear. Knowledge doesn't necessarily disappear. So it's more about, I think, reactions to war and disasters. Because after invasions and Mongol invasions and the Black Death, China began to lose lots of its cultural self-confidence, what they needed to step outside and bring innovations and ideas and people from other places. And it really then happened with the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century, which portrayed itself as the opposite of the open, bustling, dynamic China that had come before, and really turned inwards, blocking international trade, burning the ocean-going fleet, and on pain of death, stopping people from venturing abroad, and instead encouraging domestic production and building a great wall. So it's really that the minds changed, going from open minds to closed minds, and that was the beginning of a policy shift inwards.
Well, I hope the fact that we're now fining people £5,000 if they dare to go abroad doesn't indicate that we're headed down the same road as Song China.
As long as you don't burn the boats.
Yeah, right. Was there anything unique about Britain that led to the Industrial Revolution taking off here rather than elsewhere?
Well, the obvious answer compared to China is no emperor and a king with little power to rule by whim and implement monopolies and regulations and other things. Because the thing with having an emperor like China did was that when he was open to new ideas and experiments, they could make rapid progress. But the moment the emperor changed his mind, it was all ending all over the empire. Britain was always more decentralized and open to rivalry and competition between different groups and innovators. And especially after 1688, I happen to think that the Glorious Revolution was a pivotal moment in human history, because it opened up to more rule of law, predictable rules, safer property rights, and a legal system that made it difficult for the nobles and the king to interfere and suddenly change their minds about what should be acceptable and what should not be in terms of new knowledge, innovations, and so on. And that left room for the energy that's always there, that we saw in Song China and so many other civilizations. The difference was that in Britain, they didn't clamp down on it to the extent that they did in the elites, that they did in China and the Ottoman Empire and many other civilizations.
I love those two words, no emperor, as your short answer.
And that's almost a t-shirt slogan, right?
Yeah, right. Of your quartet of openness, one that's currently very controversial is open doors. How important is it to progress that a society should open its doors to outsiders and immigrants?
Well, I think immigration is incredibly important, and that's my reading of the history of successful dynamic civilizations as well. There's the obvious economic argument. If people are allowed to move to places where they are more productive, you create more. When economists talk about how we could double the size of the world economy if people were allowed to do that. So there's trillion-dollar bills on the pavement. But that's just an aspect of trade in a way. But I would say that it's even more important than trade in itself, because so much of our knowledge is non-verbalized. It's tacit knowledge about how to do things, our paradigms, our perspectives on the world, and we know more things than we can say. And the things that we can do on Zoom and that we can do in international trade, that's important. But that's not everything, because that's more about what we already know that we want to get from somebody else. Only in the meetings, when people meet, and surprising meetings, we can find more of serendipity. When people look at old problems with new, fresh eyeballs, it creates more cross-fertilization. Matt Ridley famously talked about how ideas have sex, and that creates innovation and progress. And I love that metaphor, but it gets even better when real people are involved in that kind of activity. I think we'll get even more ideas and innovations. And I might, in this moment in time that we're in, might just mention the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Nobody would have expected it in this way, coming from Turkish migrants to Germany and their children who suddenly meet the German universities and biotechnological state of knowledge, and then combining that with big pharma in the US. Suddenly we got this vaccine against COVID-19. So that's just one of the amazing surprises that we can get when people meet.
Well, what do you say to people who say that, yes, immigration certainly helped countries in the past? It obviously played a major role in Britain, it did in the United States, but they say that it's different now, that in modern times, you know, the rules have changed and the circumstances have changed. How do you answer that?
Well, I think that's true. There are differences, and one of the major ones is that we've built a generous welfare state, changing the incentives for work, investment, and for migration. That makes it more difficult to turn migration into win-win solutions. In Europe, we've seen in many countries more unemployment, social exclusion, and welfare dependency on migrants, especially refugee migration. And also, I'm sure on the margins, it affects why people migrate. Perhaps it's not always that you move to the place where you would be most productive, but perhaps where you receive the grandest welcome by the government. So I think this is problematic. It's costly, but it's even worse in terms of what it buys, that kind of behavior, that kind of social exclusion. So my preferred solution would be to deal with the welfare state rather than migration, to build a wall around the welfare state so that migrants don't get the same kind of benefits until they've worked for it. Build a wall around the welfare state rather than around the country. Okay,
we're going to pause for a short commercial break now, because on the chat bar on this site, you will now find the Amazon link if you wish to buy a copy of this book. So if you look on the chat section to the right, here we are. There is a link you can click. So just giving you a plug, Johan. Yeah.
Thank you.
It always impresses me, and your book brought this out brilliantly, that open societies in the past have not just prospered financially, economically, but have often usually done so in arts and science, in manufactures, in agriculture, and in ideas, as well as in wealth. Is this the cross-fertilization of new ideas that produces this effect?
Yes, I agree. It's wonderful when you find those episodes of efflorescence in history and how you see that suddenly it's like you have this explosion of creativity in places where you didn't expect it. And I absolutely think you're right. It's this the meeting of new ideas, when thinkers and tinkers meet and start to create and combine things in new ways. It's difficult to predict where it's going to lead us. You saw that in the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, how coffee shops suddenly became penny universities, as they were called. For a penny could buy you coffee, and then you can sit there and meet engineers and philosophers and astronomers and combine ideas and talk about the most recent discoveries and combine those ideas in new ways. So suddenly someone was working on a problem in mines, getting water out of there. Someone else was talking about atmospheric pressure. And a third person was thinking about how to use this to create a steam engine. I mean, it creates creativity in various ways, and you don't know where it's going. And it's partly self-reinforcing, because when you see this economic dynamism, it changes the culture. It makes it more open and experimental. The favorite quote of mine is Abraham Lincoln, and when he talked about young America in the time of the Industrial Revolution, with this great passion, a rage for everything new. The only thing Americans are interested in that's old, it's old whiskey and old tobacco. But apart from it, they experiment everywhere, with new horse shows, with new shoes, with perspective in art, with new music and music hall appearances. And so it's self-reinforcing, and it also, that economic dynamism, liberates time and money for other things than just working for subsistence, a new consumer class with more leisure time. And I mean, look, here we are talking about innovation and history, while our ancestors would be out in the crop fields fighting for their survival. So it is a combination of these things.
Well, let's not forget plagiarism, because you also make the point that successful societies pinch ideas from abroad, ones that work, and they are not afraid to copy new ideas that prove themselves elsewhere successful in practice. Is that an important feature of open societies, that they plagiarize success whenever they see it, and they're not sufficiently set in their ways to resist doing that?
Absolutely. I think the two things that explains our progress is innovation and imitation. The fact that it's difficult to innovate, to come up with something new that helps us to solve those problems. But it's very easy to repeat it once you've seen somebody else doing it. And that's one reason why you can see that cities with the meeting of people and minds, and generally larger populations and larger degree of population density, makes for more creativity, for the simple fact that it's easier in a large population for someone to stumble onto something new and important. Everybody stumbles and most of them fall, but someone stumbles onto something great, new, the wheel, taming fire, or eating oysters for the first time. And then it's incredibly easy to plagiarize it and imitate it. And that's one reason to keep all the lines of communication open, because we're quite adept at borrowing and plagiarizing.
We've got the first question from outside. It's from someone called Eamon Butler, who says, he asks, most societies in history have not been open societies. Why are we so reluctant to be open? Why is it that most societies have not been open?
That's a good question. And I think how I phrase it in my book is, now we've mostly talked about the good news. And the good news is that we are traders by nature. We've really developed in sync with trade and exchange, and constantly finding ways to meet strangers and specialize, borrow their best ideas, and do our best in exchange. But that's just half of our nature. And there's some bad news as well. And that's the fact that we're also tribalists by nature. We have developed these skills and abilities to cooperate harmoniously, often within tribes. Even though there were long distance trade as well, it was most usually done within our tribes, and we're a bit fearful and afraid when we deal with everybody else. And that creates lots of difficult instincts and default settings within ourselves. It is scary out there. It surprises might be the place to go to for great new ideas, but some surprises also kill you. So you have to be a bit suspicious about the world. And that's one reason that we have this tribal instinct. We tend to retreat, especially when we feel threatened. That's the moment in time when we look for our strong man to protect us. We want to hide in our group. We want the strong man or big government to protect us. It's, in a way, a designer intuition. We've created a wonderful and very complex civilization of cooperation with strangers and people that we don't know of. And their surprising innovations, they save us constantly. But that's very counterintuitive. It's very strange. And especially when it feels dangerous out there, we want that protection. And I think that's something that we constantly do battle with.
Yeah, there's nothing about open societies in history that means they must survive and endure. Indeed, all previous examples, bar one, ended their openness after a time, and they slipped backwards from progress. What are the forces at work that lead them to do that? Why do they abandon their openness and we would say retreat?
Well, in economic history, we sometimes talk about Cardwell's law, about a technology named after a technology historian, but it's Joel Moker, the economic historian, who's coined the phrase. And it's really about how societies, dynamic, growing societies, always tend to run out of steam at some point or another. And that's because there are powerful forces who don't like this openness, this open-endedness, the fact that it is a work in progress, because there are religious elites and political elites who know that they might be threatened by the next discovery. And there are economic incumbents, businesses, guilds, trade unions who know that the next economic innovation might put them out of a job. So they always fight against it. And the question is, what decides whether they win out, or whether the forces of innovation and openness do? Well, then oftentimes, and this is a pattern that it's difficult to not to see, I think, in history when you look at different civilizations. When you feel threatened, when the whole society loses cultural self-confidence, could be an economic depression, foreign invasions, natural disasters, or pandemics historically. It's something that tips the scale so that more people, more fence sitters begin to think that, yeah, they had a point, that we want stability, not innovation. And at that point in time, there's often this turn backwards towards something, an idea of something that were more stable in the past. And ironically, and that's really dark irony, is that backtracking is exactly what creates the biggest problems for these societies, because that's when they close down their society, their economy, the forces of innovation and growth. That's when they are really threatened and stagnate.
Isn't there a Benjamin Franklin quote that, you know, those who sacrifice liberty in order to gain security end up with neither? Am I right in that? Was it Franklin who said something like that? That's the...
Supposedly he did, yes.
Yeah, okay.
And they deserve neither, apparently.
Now, the one open society that did survive is, of course, this one, I would say so far. You said that basically in Britain, no personal group was powerful enough to shut it down. That power was so dispersed that the openness survived in Britain, whereas in other places there were concentrations of power that could shut it down. I'm reading you right here, aren't I? That it was yes. That dispersion of power. So if you want an open society to survive in its openness, the moral of the story is separation of powers, disperse it.
Quite right. That's my interpretation of history. Basically, every elite in history has felt threatened by openness and innovation, and they've thought about how to shut it down, but it gets more difficult when there are disagreements within the elite. And especially after the Glorious Revolution. The forces that ousted the Stuart monarchy, they were dispersed. They came from all walks of life, different classes, Whigs and Tories, and it meant that there were attempts there as well to shut down particular industries and innovations as well. And they were petitioning Parliament constantly to do this, but they were all shut down because it was difficult to form an alliance of defending a more closed society, because there was always some part of this group that wanted to push forward and onwards. And that's why you saw more dynamic British society afterwards. And then you combine that also with the international situation in Europe at that time of a very fragmented system there as well, often very centralized monarchies, but they were rivals. They were constant rivals, often fighting vicious wars with one another, but fairly open in the meaning that there was a sense of a shared culture. You could move across borders, you could put your investment somewhere else. You had the Republic of Letters, of philosophers, engineers writing letters with a new postal system developed for commercial purposes, who constantly combined ideas. And those governments and princes and kings who shut down innovation in a certain sector, they realized quite soon that they fled somewhere else. They moved across the border and began to enrich that society, and therefore also made it easier for them to win out in the in wars with them. So they had to become more open, and Britain led the way there. First the Dutch Republic, but then Britain did that, and partly also with the argument, if we don't accept these kinds of textile machinery or new forms of business models, well, then they'll go somewhere else and they will be enriched.
We've got a question here from Christian Bjornskov, who says, Joel Mocker claims, put simply, that innovative societies have freedom of speech and good judicial institutions. Which important elements would you say that Mocker's account is missing, if any?
Oh, let's see now. He mentioned free speech and
good judicial institution.
Right. Well,
what else is needed?
Well, there are
innovative society.
Well, it depends on what the good legal system is all about. But I would say that it's incredibly important with safe property rights. Basically, that creates the predictability, so that you are willing to risk something for a long-term reward, and that it's not up to the whim of the king who gets the reward, so that innovations are trade tested rather than tested by government, as Didier McCloskey would put it. I'd say I'd add openness in an international way as well, not just free speech and innovation, but free trade. Freedom to compete across borders as well is one of the most important ways, not just to create specialization and more growth, but also to make sure that everybody has to be up to date with new ideas, the state of the art when it comes to machines, know-how, and other things. So those are a few things that I would add.
Okay, we've got a question here from Kent Lassman, who says, is the open society something that can become path dependent within a given generational cohort? That is, once these values of open exchange, open doors, open minds get distributed, can we count on the open society to naturally follow?
I wish. I don't think that's the case. I think that it's still counterintuitive and strange. It's easy to do these things, the kind of exchange, the kind of creativity that we see on a person-to-person basis in our individual behavior. It comes very natural to us. We're experts. We've partly evolved to do this. And that's why we've come this far. But we have not evolved to understand it and to understand the result of these things. So that means that even if we have institutions that makes it possible for us to behave in great ways so that we create more knowledge and more production, better technology constantly. It doesn't mean that we necessarily embrace the system that creates this. And oftentimes, most people don't. And in a way, that's rational. Read history and economics constantly to be able to accomplish great things, but it means that it's constantly threatened. It doesn't happen automatically, and there's always a risk that we'll see backlashes.
Yeah. When we talk about open societies, I imagine quite a few of our viewers will have read Karl Popper's classic, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Yet his book is very much more about dealing with the enemies, Plato, Hegel, and Marx, than it is about setting out the conditions needed to maintain an open society. You deal with several tendencies in people, innate perhaps, arising from our evolutionary past, our hunter-gatherer prehistory, tendencies which threaten the relatively open society we've enjoyed. One of them you say is the us and them tendency. Does that arise from our primitive past, and does it lead to intolerance? I mean, is that one of the threats that an open society constantly faces?
Yes, I think so. I think this is part of our nature, and the threat and the temptation is always there, and it comes from tribalism. The great paradox, if you will, the original sin of our wonderfully cooperative trading selves is that it was partly developed. We partly developed our skill to cooperate harmoniously in order to kill and steal from others. Because once we've climbed to the top of the food chain, which we did out on the African savannah when we realized how we could cooperate to hunt in groups and to come up with better ideas by combining forces. We climbed to the top of the food chain, and it meant that no predator could ever threaten us again, except one, and that's other groups who cooperated even better than we do. And this is a weird paradox, because oftentimes we also traded and exchanged with them, and there are so many evidences of this that we've discussed, but it was always risky. And since we lived in an existence where we were always close to subsistence level, always close to death, it meant that we had to be suspicious. The moment we thought that somebody else in another group wasn't loyal to us, belonged to a tribe that wanted bad stuff to happen to us, or even within our group. I mean, it's costly in the short run to sacrifice for a large reward later on. So if there are free riders out there, we need to know them. That's one of the reasons why we've developed this big brain, to keep track of social relationships and to spread rumors about who doesn't pitch in. So we are good at cooperating, but we also had to keep a worried eye out for raiders and free riders. And that's one reason why we're so quick to divide groups into us and them. Oversensitive, I would say. Any kind of cue that tells us that the other guy roots for the other soccer team tells us something, that's a scary person, we should avoid them. And unfortunately, this informs how we behave politically and economically. It's always very easy to get us back to this kind of tribalism. And there are many experiments in social psychology where people, even putting them in groups based on arbitrary things like the flip of a coin, for example, and then put them in a situation, in an economic game where they're supposed to reward certain people and punish others. Well, then you want to reward those who belong to your own group and punish the others, even though it's just a flip of a coin or your taste in arts or what have you. And that, but it gets even worse. It's not just that it's some sort of group egoism. It gets worse. It's that we are willing to forego a reward for our own group, those who root for our team or our taste in art or our flip of the coin, in order to punish the other group even more. So we want to have as large as possible divide between our groups. So that tells us something important. It seems like we're just crazy, but it makes perfect sense if we develop these us and them instincts in a situation where we played kind of a zero-sum game. So if the other group got much more power or resources or got stronger, it was a threat to our survival. So we had to be a bit worried about them. And that's dangerous because nowadays, in a modern economy based on the rule of law, safe, secure property rights, it means that we often think of that as a zero-sum game and behave accordingly. And then when we punish them, we punish ourselves, basically.
Yes, we separate people into groups in the UK by their accent, by the way, but we're very good at spotting whether people are us or them by the way they talk.
That's a good thing about being a foreigner when you're in Britain.
You're
it's
neutral.
More difficult.
They do say that the most acceptable accent in England is educated Scots. One of our famous commentators, Andrew Neil, speaks with an educated Scots accent, and that makes him classless in England, you see. So he's neither us nor them, you see. So he's, as you say, the foreigner, the outsider. Rob Walters asked about patent protection. Is this the opposite of what an open society ought to do, with the rapid interchange of ideas, people copying ideas and taking the best elements of other people's ideas? And yet patent protection seems to go against that, doesn't it? Is it compatible?
Yes, now it gets complicated because there are important openness arguments on both sides, I would say. In one way, yes, imitation and plagiarism is one of the engines of world history and of the economy, learning by others and stealing their ideas. I mean, when I write my book, I don't really know where my ideas begin and those that I've learned from end. So it's all a mixture of everything. And so it should be. On the other hand, if ideas are this important and investing in it and working hard to come up with new, strange and weird solutions is that important? It's not just imitation, it's also innovation. Well, perhaps then it's also important to get some reward for that. And if it's too easy to plagiarize and imitate, and the obvious example here would be certain drugs that you can just reverse engineer the chemical compound and then you'll steal it, and then we won't get much research done in those areas. So personally, I think that there are strong openness arguments in both ways. So that's perhaps an argument for time-limited protection for patents and copyrights. But perhaps we've gone too far in certain ways.
It's a kind of compromise, isn't it, between innovation and imitation? We give them a limited period in order to encourage both of those things to happen, I suppose. Got a question?
Quite right. So I guess the natural solution then would be to have various intellectual property rights protections systems in different places and experiment with it. That would be the basic open solution.
Anthony Nordberg. Now he's got a D in his name, so it's clearly not a relative of yours. So Anthony Nordberg asks, to what extent do you feel the growth of the public sector represents a threat to the open society, to the concept of a compulsory charity, which is what the public sector in many cases is? How far does its growth pose a threat to the open society?
I think it poses a threat in almost any incarnation, because and you might need some of it, so it doesn't mean that we should abolish all parts of the public sector, but it means that in every incarnation it is a command control structure. It is a way of designing systems and solutions to our problems, and I'm with Hayek saying that the best way to stop all kinds of progress is to take the best state of knowledge today and make it mandatory, or subsidize it with tax money and implement it everywhere. And that's basically what the public sector does in various incarnations, because then you block the experiments, you block the strange new ways of doing this that might be the next solution that would help us all. So I'm worried that the moment it grows too much, and in mature European welfare states, we've definitely come too far when it comes to the growth of the public sector, and it begins to eke out much of the innovation and experimentation. One interesting thing that I would look at, and I would like to see more research done in, is actually the Swedish experiment in opening up the public sector for more private providers, more choice by families in school, with school voucher systems, with private providers in healthcare, elderly care, and so on, because that's a way to create this a compromise in the public sector, so that you have the tax, you tax fund it, but on the other hand, you expose it to choice, and therefore also some learning, new knowledge, and competition between private providers. And it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. Perhaps this turns out to be the savior of the public sector, because it really needs some saving.
Crucially, what that does is to turn the public sector from a top-down affair to a bottom-up one. If you're allowing parents and patients to make choices that ultimately determine where public funds flow, you've turned top down into bottom up. So maybe that is the way to stop the public sector being a threat to the open society, to democratize the choices within it. Do you agree?
It could, absolutely. And that's why I think it's interesting, it's encouraging, and I'm interested to see where it ends up. The problem is that the moment it's in the public sector, it becomes this kind of tug of war between different interest groups. And there's always the temptation to regulate it further and to make sure that we do it in the same kind of way all over the country, for example. And that puts a limit to the kind of experimentation that could take place. But it's worth looking at.
We have a catchphrase in Britain to cover, to resist different things being done in different places and experimentation. We use the phrase postcode lottery, which is taken to be a bad thing. And it means that you get different qualities and levels of service depending on where you live. Whereas, of course, one of the important things about an open society is this variety and experimentation. So you can see in practice which things work. And if you have different communities practicing different things, you have a lot of experiments going on, and you can, so to speak, copy the best practice, ones that produce the best results. Okay, look, a question from Nicholas Dunn McAfee. He says, are there any obvious litmus tests that signal whether or not a particular society is open-minded? Are there any things that stand out, that you look at and say, yes, for this reason, we know that this society is open-minded?
That's a good question.
You mentioned rule of law at the very beginning, of course.
Yes, perhaps I should have had a litmus test at the end of my book. I think there are basic institutions that you need to have in place, the rule of law being an incredibly important one. But if we were going for not really looking at the institutions, but rather the results, the real litmus test, is this society open or isn't it? I would say some kind of litmus test that would reveal whether they fall for the not invented here solution. The kind of thing that we see in any organization or business and country. If it's an idea from somewhere else that doesn't fit with the way we used to do things, if you don't have room for that kind of surprise, then you're not really an open society, which tells you that we're all kind of a mixture, because we've seen that in not the least during the pandemic, how certain countries thought that, no, we don't want that kind of test for COVID-19. We want a test of our own. We want certain rules and regulations in place that wouldn't accept this kind of experimentation over here. So it's all, it is complicated, but that would be the closest, I think, to a litmus test we get.
Well, Eamon Butler asks a second question. He wants us to hold our litmus paper up to the European Union. He asks, is it an open society? Mischievous question.
It is yet to be seen, because it's really, I think, the best of unions and the worst of unions, because I am still devoted to the basic idea of the four freedoms, to make sure that we have openness across borders for goods, services, capital, and people. If you have that, and if they were really devoted to that idea, it would be wonderful, because it would be an opportunity then also to experiment with different solutions and different institutions, a certain institutional competition, so that we can all move to and invest in the places that make the most sense, so that others have to imitate it. It could be the best union then. The problem is that there is that temptation, and it has been there from the start as well, to turn it into a centralized structure whereby you standardize all those things, and they're never satisfied, because they always think that the solution to every problem is more Europe, and to have one size fits all when it comes to the procurement of vaccines, or tax standards, or data standards, and so on. Which means, and some of the worst examples that we see now, I think, it comes from the European Union. If you look at the kind of vaccine nationalism that we have in the European Union, it's certainly an example of that's how a closed society thinks. The factory is here on our land. It might have a contract with other places to sell there, but we want the vaccines, so let's stop them from exporting, which obviously the result will only be that pharmaceutical companies will think twice before they invest in the European Union the next time around. Perhaps they should invest in a smaller country with a small population, so that they would never have an incentive to restrict exports. But this is really a long way of saying that both those things are there in the European Union. And I devote much of my time to fight against all the bad closed aspects of the EU.
Yes, we've got a question from Graham Sedgley, interesting one here. He wants you to comment briefly about Japan. He says it appears to be quite insular and yet still successful. Does it fit in with this general thesis that successful societies have to be open to the outside? First of all, you might disagree that Japan is insular, but Graham Sedgley says that it appears to be so, and yet, of course, it has been successful.
Yes, that's an interesting. It's an interesting country, because in a way it is a country that we often associate with an insular mindset and very low levels of migration, for example. On the other hand, it's one of the countries, I think, that is most impressive when it comes to learning from the technology of other places. And this goes a long way back, obviously, to the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s, when the Japanese understood that if they did not throw their doors completely open to foreign ideas and technology, they would be dominated by Western colonialists. And in just a few decades, an extremely traditional society ruled by the samurai started to build railroads and shipyards and textile mills and telegraph lines, street lines, and consumers started to wear Western clothes and hats and even Western style mustaches in a matter of just a few years, and began to industrialize at breakneck speed afterwards. And this is something that you saw again, I think, after the Second World War, and also having by then, just as during the Meiji Restoration, partly not by choice, but very much openness to trade with the rest of the world. So it's managed in a weird way to combine a culture that feels one of few cultures that feels really different from a Western style culture, but combining that with an openness to technologies and goods. So I don't know how you strike that balance if you're interested in it, but at least you need that a kind of economic and political openness, so that businesses and people are allowed to import these ideas.
Mm. Okay,
and I would add one thing: the area where they have been most insular when it comes to migration. That's also a very worrying area, of Japan in the future with their kind of demographic profile. This is one reason why they have to invest so much in robots, because someone is going to have to take care of all the old Japanese in nursing homes in the future. And this is one reason why the government is working hard to try to find acceptance for more migration.
Okay. It's Kent Lessman. He says, how would you rate the state of openness of contemporary science vis-a-vis political correctness? I'd have thought science is a fairly good example of openness, because you have to publish your papers and open yourself to the criticism and peer review and evaluation. And I'd have thought myself that Kent Lessman's question, yes, contemporary science is an example of what you ought to do, whereas political correctness is an example of what you ought not to do. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree. And I would say so far, I'm not that worried when it comes to natural sciences. And when you build bridges and when you develop vaccines, then it doesn't really matter who said it or why or how they behave or what they said in their last tweet. These are extremely open fields of science with a level of international cooperation that we've never seen before. And especially I'm impressed during the pandemic era, how scientists on different in every country cooperate in real time. They basically have their Slack accounts and writing up all their comparing notes and constantly opening up their minds to ideas from other places. I am worried about the social sciences and what goes on there, and a degree of political correctness and cancel culture that in certain areas at certain universities, it's gone further, I would say, in the United States than it has in Europe, but something that's incredibly worrying. And it doesn't matter what you believe in, it doesn't matter what you think about the kind of ideas that they are willing to impose, because one thing we learn from history is that any kind of orthodoxy destroys openness. Any kind of thought that you in journalism or at the university already know the truth about things always results in dismantling the open-endedness, the work in progress that's the basic idea of science and of universities. And my favorite example from history is how Aristotelian ideas about the world, which were for a very long time the state of the art, the most brilliant mind on the planet, I would say, Aristotle, discovering the laws of logic and doing empirical science, more impressive than most people until even the Enlightenment. Well, even his ideas could be turned into orthodoxy when the Catholic Church took not his method, but his answers, and said that these are the answers that you all have to reach for, whatever kind of science you're doing, whatever you write. Even those brilliant ideas could result in a stifling orthodoxy that almost destroyed European universities in the 16th and 17th century. And that, I think, is an incredibly important lesson from history. No matter what you think about what happens to be politically correct, trying to impose it on everybody, trying to cancel everybody who thinks something else, that will ruin everything.
Elberg, if I've pronounced that name correctly, if I haven't, I apologize. Asks, could there be too much openness? Could society grow too fast? Could we get adaptation problems? More knowledge means more power and more opportunity for abusing power. So can one have too much openness?
No and yes. If we're talking about the general advance of progress and of technology, I would say that the historical record tells us that this is an exception. Just being able to continue to make progress is something amazing. We shouldn't take it for granted. We should do everything to try to make sure that it continues. And even though it might seem overwhelming, the point of living in a commercial society is that every greedy engineer and entrepreneur is hard at work trying to make it accessible to all of us, so that even I understand how to use the Zoom, for example. I just saw the other day I think it was a 1940s cartoon from the US about how difficult it'll be to be a housewife in the future with all this modern technology. Electricity, nobody understands what electricity is. How are you going to run the toaster, the dishwasher? And she's standing there in the cartoon with all these cables thinking this is going to be impossible. But obviously, you don't have to understand what electricity is to plug it in and push the right button. So I'm not afraid of being overwhelmed in that sense. On the other hand, the reason why I'm qualifying my answer is that there is certainly a risk of that disruption at a large scale, whereby we see dramatic shifts and changes in old ways of doing things, old business models destroyed. That could result in fear. It could result in disappointment. It could result in reactions against openness in itself. Now we're not there. I think we have the opposite risk of too little productivity and innovation. But at times, I think historically we've seen that with urbanization and industrialization. It was overwhelming to lots of people. The good thing now, this time around, is that even though there are stronger technological forces than ever that can disrupt things and change our own old ways of doing things, there are also stronger technological accessories that'll help us out to educate ourselves in things. From the individual silly versions of me being able to Google any kind of problem that I have with my computer, with finding the digits for my new Oculus or what have you, because there's always an answer somewhere there, to ways of being able to constantly upgrade our skills in the future and retrain ourselves, which I think should be a growth field in the future if we see more disruption on the labor market.
Anthony Nordberg comes with a supplemental on that question about science, by the way. He points out that he says the science scene in the UK is state funded. That is essentially part of the public sector. Is it therefore inimical to openness because it's state funded? Now, the man on this would be Terence Keeley, wouldn't it? Who has fought a campaign against state funding. So I suppose let's ask the larger question. Should we be very wary about state funded science?
I think we should. And because the answer here is obviously it depends. It depends on what else does the government hand over but money? How much do they want to direct and design research? And obviously there is a trade-off there. You don't want to hand money over just like that, because that could be completely wasted. On the other hand, if they direct and design too much, it stifles progress in open-ended research. So it's always a danger. There's always a difficulty there. My personal preference is, if the government is involved, the best thing they can do is to create awards, basically, for coming up with answers to strange questions. If they really want a vaccine, let's just say that they're willing to pay for it. If you come up with a vaccine that makes it through the clinical trials, we'll pay you $2 billion and hand over the doses. Because that's a way of not interfering with the research, not trying to tell who is best at doing this, who's best placed, who has the knowledge, but a way of just put an incentive on your problem and making sure that everybody else can then look at it and see, can I contribute? Can I do something? And obviously you can do that in other fields of research. If you want to beam electricity from the atmosphere to the planet, well, NASA can give you a couple of billions if you come up with a solution. If you want to have a vaccine against malaria, you can just offer a reward. I think that would be the best way of combining giving money, making sure that it's not just frivolous, spent on anything, but at the same time, not trying to second guess researchers and entrepreneurs.
Yeah. One thing I have against the EU's method of regulation is that it tends to be what we call process driven. They tell you what you must do and how you must do it. Whereas what you're talking about is result driven. You say what the target is and leave it to human inventiveness, ingenuity, to devise different ways of achieving that target. So yes, put up the money, NASA, for those who can find a way of doing this, but we leave it to you to find that way. We're coming near the end now, so I want to ask you, I said you were the only person I'd met who was as optimistic as I am. But look, we've just seen a revival in trade protectionism. We've seen a surge in anti-immigrant feeling in certain parts of the world, a determination, particularly in universities, to shut down free speech if it makes people feel uncomfortable. These trends are all hostile to an open society. Now, are you optimistic that our open society can withstand them, or will it go the way all previous open societies have gone?
Yes, I don't want to disappoint you too much. That I'm still on the optimist team, but I keep thinking about Arnold Toynbee, the historian, who said that, there's not a natural lifespan to cultures and civilization. It's not that they have a DNA and they just die of old age. Cultures die of two things. They die from murder and from suicide. And most often it's suicide. And that's my thinking as well. Most often cultures, economies, civilizations, they die because they lose faith in their greatest strength, the openness to surprises and to innovation. And we are in that kind of backlash right now in the Western world and in many other parts of the world as well. The sense of the world being dangerous has pushed many to long for the good old days, or for the strong man, or for the big government to protect them. And so I fear for our open world right now, because these tendencies are strong. But I am an optimist because what sets this period of time apart from most others that I've studied is that now it's a fairly open world. It's a fragmented, decentralized world where it's not just the case that if we fail miserably in Europe, everything falls down.
Yes, correct.
Was the case 60 years ago.
We've still got Singapore, we've still got other countries. Yeah, precisely. We're running out of time.
So if we drop the ball, somebody else is bound to pick it up.
We're running out of time. We've got to close it there. So first of all, Johan, thank you for that extraordinary performance. Yeah, it's been wonderful listening to you. And I would repeat one final time, buy the book. Secondly, I have to thank our viewers. We hope we kept you informed and entertained. And I tell you that the next Adam Smith Institute webinar is next Tuesday on March the 30th, and it is on the subject of Adam Smith's legacy. So on that note, Johan, thank you very much. And to our audience, bye.
Thank you so much, Madsen. Thanks.